I'm going to mostly talk about maps because for the past 10 years I've been creating and disseminating what I'll call for now radical cartography or critical cartography or counter-cartography. I make maps as my art practice, but I also think about them in other ways or produce things about them in other ways. So I've co-curated 2 exhibitions about maps and mapping. Yeah, better? Okay. And then recently co-edited a book, An Atlas of Radical Cartography with Lize Mogel. And then there's an exhibition that's going around about that. And because I'm speaking now about my own work, I'm going to be talking about the atlas during the panel, just so I don't repeat myself. And it feels like this is the right time for this kind of conversation to be happening about contestational cartographies, and in conjunction with the exhibition Experimental Geography, because there really is a kind of critical mass in thinking about geography and mapping within the art world and in other disciplines like geography, obviously, and also architecture, urban planning, activism. There's this kind of movement that's been happening, or I think of it as a movement between artists, designers, geographers, activists, really taking maps out of their kind of traditional place and using them in other ways. So for myself, I use maps for a couple of reasons. One, because they merge information and aesthetics, and they also suggest users rather than viewers, and that can be a kind of active thing. And also because of their form, because of their familiarity and their form, then I can engage a public beyond an art audience. That's really what I'm concerned with, such as Los Angeles bus riders, residents and tourists in Idaho town, so on and so forth. So some of my projects have been inserted into public space as, for example, as bus shelter advertising or through everyday distribution networks like newspapers. Another reason why I like maps is because as works on paper, because what I do is not digital, or not electronic. They're accessible, they're easy and cheap to reproduce and to distribute. And most of my work is distributed for free or for very cheap. I work outside of the gallery system. I'm also very interested in maps because they have historically and are now used politically. They're also the most familiar way that the general public understands their relationship to space, and on a very different scale than we experience in everyday life. A typical map offers a God's eye view, or you can translate that into an aerial view. You see some of those up there. It's a viewpoint that's all-seeing, supposedly all-seeing, all-knowing. And this view can be very useful. It can allow us to understand complex systems, but it can also be abstracting. And the God's eye view is an important part of the geographical imagination, but it's also a major aspect for critiquing conventional maps. The God's eye view is traditionally instrumental in the map's function as a tool of power used by governments or by the military for control of territory, for colonization, exploitation of resources, and so on. But I'm also fascinated with the God's eye view, and I use it a lot in my own work. And I just wanted to illustrate this with some photos from my collection of aerial photos taken from windows of airplanes. And I have a kind of obsessive habit of doing this. And I used to go back and forth between LA and New York a lot, and I would make sure to sit on the opposite side of the plane going and coming, and make sure that, when I was going there, I was sitting on the right side because there would be sun glare on the left side, and, so I have like hundreds of photos of the same aerial views over and over. I want to make sure I'm sitting away from the wing. Here's some more. And I'm showing you these partly because even though I can intellectualize my interest in maps, I also like them on a very, very visceral level. And a lot of other people do too. In the past 2 years, I've been doing a lot of traveling and talking about the atlas and my work. And a lot of people come up to me and they say, I really love maps. I hear it over and over. It seems almost universal. But 2 years ago, I was in a panel with an artist from Nigeria, Chris Ikwemesi, who started off his talk saying, I hate maps. Maps destroyed my country. And that makes sense, because if you think about the colonization of Africa and how the map of colonization was forced onto a place where there wasn't those sort of hard political boundaries weren't there previously. And I'll come back to this problematics of the map in a little bit. I wanted to start very quickly showing you my first mapping project and my first public art project or public information project. And this is called Public Green. It's a project I did in LA in 2001 and 2002. And it's a bus shelter poster, and it's a mapping of public green space in Los Angeles. And public green, the double meaning of public green, meaning public parks, but also the color of money and the idea of social capital versus finance capital. And looking at the distribution, the unequal distribution of green space in Los Angeles and in many other cities where it's unequally distributed across class and racial lines. So in LA, poorer areas have less parks, they're less frequently maintained, they're farther apart, they're smaller. In wealthier areas, you can really tell the wealth of a city like LA by how green it is, not just in terms of how much money there is, but more street trees, bigger parks. That really talks about the economic and the social, the economic wealth of the neighborhood. So this project was a bus shelter poster because in LA, bus riders statistically are low income. I think when I was doing this project, the statistic was that 65% of bus riders made under $15,000 a year. So that's pretty low income. If you have means in LA, you have a car. Buses are very inconvenient, they're slow. You have to travel long distances, it takes a very long time. And in low-income neighborhoods of LA, there are less parks, but there's also more of what's considered blighted land. So brownfields, abandoned buildings, vacant lots, condemned properties. And at the time I did this project, there was a lot of money being funneled into projects which were remediating these kinds of places, spaces, and turning them into parks. So there wasn't actually, this information wasn't necessarily public knowledge, nor was there really an accessible map of all of the parks in LA. So I produced this map independently, got a grant from the city, convinced Viacom International, who owned all of the transit shelter real estate, to put it up as a public service announcement. It went up right after in December of 2001, and one of the effects of 9/11 was that companies pulled their advertising, a lot of advertising. I forget why, actually. I think because maybe it seemed frivolous or they were cutting their budgets. I can't really remember the reasons. But what happened is that there was a lot of empty real estate, so this was able to be inserted for about a year and a half into bus shelters all over the city, and every month the MTA would swap them out and put them someplace else. And so for me, this is a really ideal way of working where advertising advertising space can be used for advocacy. And I'm just going to show you this because this was, I also worked with some individual communities that had kiosks, transit shelter kiosks donated to them for community postings. And I guess in this community, they didn't have much to post about because this is 4 years later. And a friend of mine saw this and took the picture, and I just like it because here the map is becoming the landscape again, becoming more topographic. But what I'm mostly working on now is popular representations of the world, including the world map. And I'm very interested in the world map because it's a traditional authoritative form. I'm very interested in unpacking it and creating a kind of critical cartography. So the world map is one of the oldest, I would say one of the oldest design objects in the world. It's existed in practically the same form for centuries. But as a representation of the world, it's highly problematic. World map as a two-dimensional object requires a translation of the spherical shape of the Earth onto a flat surface called a projection, and I think Pablo's going to talk about this later. And this is a mathematical problem, basically. And likewise, the translation of the political world onto the map is a kind of ideological problem. So if you think about a world map, not this one, you're the conventional world map, north-oriented world map, it presents a very specific set of political relationships based on physical geography that most people don't question. What I like about this south-oriented, or inverted, I guess you could say inverted, map is that it literally turns our ideas of these relationships on its head. So if you think about, what's on top, who's on top in the traditional world map is North America, US, Canada, Russia, Europe. What's more dominant here is South America, Africa, Australia. This is more than Australian propaganda, the South-oriented map. There's actually a historical precedent to it. I'll just show you one. This is a map from, I think, the 11th century by a North African cartographer working for the Spanish royal court named Ali Disri. And this is a south-oriented map. A lot of maps during that time were south-oriented or east-oriented. East, for example, being where the sun rose, Mecca, paradise was. But today, mostly because of ship navigation, the maps needing to be used for navigation, north orientation is the way that we represent and understand global geography. So let's look at my favorite north-oriented world map, and maybe one of the most familiar maps, map as symbols in the world. So the UN emblem, which is a kind of extreme north-oriented map. And so, you know, pictured from the north, but from this vantage point, again, the God's eye view. And this is a map of the world representing an azimuthal equidistant projection centered on the North Pole. And just a little side note, who created this famous map? It was the designers at the US Office of Strategic Services, and they created it in 1945. It wasn't intended to be the emblem for the UN, but it became that. And this is actually the copy of the sheet that was presented to the General Assembly to vote on making this the symbol. And originally it only included the world to the 40th parallel, cutting off some of the southern countries or distorting them. And then after some complaining, it was expanded to the 60th parallel so that the southern nations were less distorted and more physically present. So the UN emblem symbolically portrays the world as a place of equals, a world existing in harmony with unilateralism. There are no borders between the nations. But from a design standpoint, it's almost impossible to depict the world in a way that doesn't show dominance. There's always something on top. Something's always bigger than the others, or at the center. And if you think about traditional design competition, the center is usually the focal point. So what is at the center of the UN logo? It's kind of a blank spot, which doesn't really speak to the political realities of the area. And I did a project a year ago, 2 years ago, titled Area of Detail, which zooms in on the center, literally zooms in on the center of the UN logo, which is the Arctic Circle, which is mostly, right now, an icebound ocean with surrounding nations. You've got Denmark, Canada, the US, Russia, and Norway peeking out down there. And actually, this is in a show right now at Spaces in Cleveland, if anyone lives in Cleveland. So the Arctic Circle is one of these shared spaces, like Antarctica in a way, although a little differently because no one really lays claim to it yet. It's regulated by the UN through the Law of the Sea, which sets how nations define and exploit their territorial boundaries. But because of climate change and the Arctic ice rapidly receding, it opens up new possibilities for commerce and capital. So this area of detail is becoming a focal point in other ways as the surrounding nations attempt to claim parts of it in order to explore and exploit energy resources such as oil and natural gas. And the USGS has a statistic that 25% of the world's unexplored oil resources are under the Arctic, and also commercial routes in terms of shipping lanes. So with the installation, this is a rotating map table. So you stand there and you turn it, and you can read. There's information that's arranged in rings around it that explains the kind of story. And then on the wall, there's a part of Article 76 of the UN part of Article 76 from the UN Law of, what is it? I'm missing something. Convention of the Law of the Sea. I'm missing something here. I wrote it down, but anyway, it's part of the regulation that defines the limits of territory, namely the extent of the continental shelf, so where the land meets the seafloor, and a nation's right to that land. And for the most part, there's a 200-mile economic boundary on any ocean, any nation that is connected to a body of water or an ocean. So 200 miles beyond the land border is where the economic boundary ends, and that's where a nation's right ends. After that is international. And the UN regulates this with a very long process where nations have to submit scientific proof that the continental shelf attaches physically to various undersea features like ridges, mountains, and thus extending the territorial boundary. The UN has a regulatory role, but it can't really enforce it. And then recently, well, a couple of years ago, like a year and a half ago, Russia sent a deep-sea submersible to the North Pole and planted a flag there and said, hey, it's ours. You know, we own everything from the North Pole to our shores. And of course, all of the other nations were like, yeah, right, you better be kidding. You know, and it's a publicity stunt, but it also hints at, you know, possible future contentions that right now are very diplomatically kind of worked out. The UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf is a regulatory body, and there's a process for submitting requests for expanding boundaries into the Arctic. And all of the Arctic nations are doing sonar exploration and other kinds of exploration of the sea floor to try to prove their connections. But so far only Russia and Norway have submitted, and really not much has been decided. There's kind of a stasis. And all of this is moderated through the submission process. Everything's moderated through this kind of diplomatic language, and part of the installation is an archive of some of this correspondence of the submissions of Norway and Russia, and then the responses. So here's, it's hard to see, Norway's response to Russia. Russia submitted their claim in 2001. You know, it's all very diplomatic. The permanent mission of Norway to the United Nations presents its compliments to the Secretary General, blah, 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 has the honor to refer to his communication, blah, 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 blah. So basically it says, you know, we got Russia's submission and we don't really buy it. And so what they did is because Norway and Russia have there's three parts of this, the ocean in between Norway, Russia, and Iceland, that are in contention, called the banana hole, the loophole, and I forget the other one. So what Norway did is it laid out its coordinates of what it considers to be its territory. So it's basically kind of like a dog marking its territory, but in this very diplomatic way. Another kind of world map. Another thing I'm interested in is another popular representation of the world is our World's Fairs or international expos. And I'm not sure how many people know what that is. Just a few. Yeah, there haven't been World's Fairs in the US since 1984. The last one was in New Orleans. But these used to be very, very popular in the US, and now they happen in Europe and Asia for the most part. They're spectacles of culture and commerce, and where global geography is basically displaced onto a local map. And these were very popular in the past era, before cheap air travel and electronic media were so prevalent. And it was one of the ways that people were actually able to feel like they could experience the world, or ways that they learned to picture the world. So at World's Fairs, ideas of progress and the future were often invoked. Nations and corporations were represented, or represented themselves with spectacular pavilions of spectacular architecture and displays of industrial, commercial, human innovation. And until the 50s, actually, it was common practice for Asians and Africans to be represented by ethnographic displays of native villages, which were almost always placed in the sideshow area. So there was a very different way of representing or being represented. So I think of the World's Fairs as a kind of world map, and this is an image of the countries that participated in the 1964 New York City World's Fair, basically transposing the placement of the pavilions with actual nation shapes to think about what kind of political relationships those placements suggested. Because you can kind of read the World's Fairs as a world map in terms of the site plans, which were very often markers of the global geopolitics of the time. or you can look at how the hierarchy of how national and corporate pavilions were placed. So that's one thing that interests me, but also what I'm really interested in is the development of the fair site. So I've visited fair sites all over the US and some in Europe and in Canada, and most recently in China. So looking at how these places were created, sometimes they were literally created by landfill, or they were created by clearing land, usually that had people on it already, and so with very heavy-handed tactics of slum clearance or urban renewal. These are some sort of official language that's used to do these kinds of things. And then I'm also interested in what these sites are today, and I'm just going to very quickly show you a couple of places. This is San Francisco's Treasure Island, 1938 World's Fair. Chicago, 1933 World's Fair. Montreal, 1967, Expo 67. And there's actually a world international garden there now, so there's another kind of layering of the world. And actually that's why I came to the UN project, the project about the UN logo, is because the New York City World's Fair site had 2 World's Fairs on it, and in between it was the first home of the UN. And this is Knoxville, Tennessee with the Sun Sphere, and New York City. Another thing I'm interested in about these places is doing interventions on these former World's Fair sites that again transmit something about the world, but with a much more critical outlook or worldview. So this is a project from a few years ago on the San Francisco World's Fair site of 1915, which celebrated the Panama Canal. And and I'll explain a little bit about the history of the Panama Canal in a couple of minutes, but basically it's planting small Panamanian flags all over the fair site in a kind of humorous way of claiming San Francisco for Panama, just as the US claimed part of Panama for the US for almost 100 years. And it also refers to flags, Panamanian flags, being planted in the canal zone as an act of protest 3 times in the 60s and 70s that eventually led to riots and popular, a kind of popular movement in returning the canal zone to Panamanian rule. And now I'm also working with 2 other artists in doing a kind of alternative tour guide to certain World's Fair sites. So we're doing a map, audio tour, podcasts, and maps. And I've also been creating maps that use the World's Fairs as a jumping off point to talk about larger global economies. And this also goes back to what I was saying earlier about the world map as a kind of design problem. Because I still think the world map is incredibly relevant. It's so familiar. It's the most basic form of describing basic global relationships and identity. And when you think about the current state of the world or effects of globalization, to use a slightly outdated term, it's an ideal source material to work from. So I've been experimenting with rearranging the world map so that it conveys a different kind of politics than that suggested by geography alone. But that also still retains the symbolic value of the world map and the familiarity of the nation shapes and how they're culturally understood. So you can think of these as map mashups that reorder the world based on connections between places, their histories, and contemporary global practices. It's a world map whose form is determined by the processes of globalization. There's quite a lot of text on it, so I'm going to take you through this as a kind of geography lesson. The title of the piece is Mappa Mundi. And so the text kind of connects all of these places in a narrative continuous narrative with common themes of displacement, commerce, sovereignty. We'll start here with San Francisco, and so that's San Francisco on the left and Oakland on the right. And there's an outline on San Francisco, a little outline. That is the site of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, which is the World's Fair. And like I said before, it was held to celebrate the Panama Canal, which opened a year earlier. And the Panama Canal, to give you a very, very, very brief history, was this kind of triumph of American engineering and might, I guess, national might. And the French started the canal, failed miserably for a number of reasons, and then the Americans stepped in and finished it along the way, helping to orchestrate the Panama's independence from Colombia. It was a part of Colombia until 1904, and the US helped orchestrate its independence. And in doing so, negotiated the canal, the ability to build the canal, and also to have, to take the property on either side of the canal as American sovereign territory, so that was the Canal Zone. But the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition put San Francisco on the map as a port city. And there's a popular map that was distributed at the time called Exposition City, but it's not an image of the fairgrounds. The fairgrounds are in the background. What's in the foreground are the busy shipping piers of the Embarcadero. And this is the port of Oakland, which is a little bit east of San Francisco. And it's the 5th largest container port in the US now. 80% of the cargo comes from Asia. It goes back and forth between US and Asia. And of course, like most waterfronts, there's less use. It's being less used for its original use, shipping. And there's been quite a lot of gentrification, and now there's a conflict between the traditional use of the port and the residential, high-end residential neighborhoods built on former port lands. And here, I'm just going to throw in a bunch of Google Earth slides because I love them. This is an image of the port of Oakland. You can see all the container ships. Here's Panama. The Canal Zone, the Panama Canal was, I consider it one of the critical points, and I guess you could say the story of globalization, because it created this kind of shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific that was unprecedented. Before that, ships had to go around the entire South American continent, and it took a long time. It was quite dangerous. So it really revolutionized shipping, commercial shipping, and it was also very strategic militarily for the US. Like I said, the area around the canal, which is the middle there, was US sovereign territory for about 90 years. And there's this great documentary by Frederick Weissman that you should see if you can sit through 3 hours of it, called Canal Zone. And after about the first 20 minutes, you have no idea that this is taking place in Latin America. You think that you're in a Midwestern American town. And one other note is that as soon as the canal was built, it started to become obsolete because as shipping grew, ships became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a class of ships called Panamax, which is the maximum size that can fit through the Panama Canal. And now ships are much bigger than that. So last year, 2 years ago, Panamanians passed a referendum to widen the canal, so to keep up with the pace of shipbuilding. This is Canada, and this kind of exaggerated path through the Canadian Arctic is the Northwest Passage, and this is another historic shipping route that was explored many times, almost impassable because of ice, but because of global warming, climate change, whichever word you like, is now open in the summer for ship traffic. And there's a big kind of struggle between Canada and the US and Russia and other nations. Canada considers it internal waters, and other nations would like it to be considered international waters so that it can pass through freely. And of course, Canada has a vested interest in making sure that this passage, because it cuts through its territory, remains under Canadian control. And so they're taking steps to militarize some of the islands, and they make sure that they kind of underscore their physical presence on some of these islands. And so the Northwest Passage would be a kind of another Panama Canal because it would create yet another shorter shipping route between Atlantic and Pacific. This is the outline of about, at the time that I did this, it was about 90 ships, now it's about 70. Ships in storage in the Suisun Bay, which is east of San Francisco. And it's called a mothball fleet. It's basically in cold storage. So this is the end of any story about any sort of economy, is the detritus of what's left over, where the garbage. Here's another
lovely Wikipedia image. These things are enormous. And if you're ever flying from San Francisco going east, sit on the left side, because you can see it. So some of these ships date back to the Korean War, Vietnam War. They're basically a lot of battleships and other kinds of military ships, and that have been decommissioned. There's a few that are maintained in readiness in case the U.S. needs a few extra battleships. They could be used, but most of them are just waiting to be recycled or broken down, trashed. And environmentalists in the Bay are putting a lot of pressure on the government to do something about them, because these are old ships and they're leaching heavy metals and other things into the bay and making things toxic for animals, marine life, humans. Oh, I just wanted to show you this. This is why I love the Google Earth community. This is somebody who was probably a former, someone in the Navy who was able to identify every single one of these ships. And so I found this a couple of years ago, and then I looked for it more recently and it was gone, but I still could find the conversation thread, and the guy who posted it said, oh, I had to take this off, you know why. I actually don't, but yeah, I can guess. So these are all, the USS Iowa. I mean, if you know your military history, you probably recognize some of these names. So another part of the story of the global economy is labor, exploitative labor. So what happens to ships when they die is, some of these military ships, a lot of them are broken up in the US. There's actually regulations about that. But some of them are actually sold and resold and resold and become part of this used ship economy, just like used cars. They get passed down until they just don't run anymore. And what happens to a lot of these ships and other ships is that when they die, they are towed to shipbreaking yards and broken up. And a lot of these shipbreaking yards are in South Asia. Some of them are in Asia, East Asia. So they're in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the labor conditions are horrible. Here's a Google Earth view of the Alang shipyard in Pakistan, in India. And you can see how enormous these ships are. They're just dragged up onto the beach, and it's basically people with no shoes using hand tools to break up huge ships, and sometimes they still have fuel in them, and there's explosions. It's really a very bad business, but very important to the local economy. In Bangladesh, for example, the steel that's recycled from ships, these ships, goes into the local economy and is just about the only domestic steel that exists. And then recently, Greenpeace and other organizations, other NGOs have been working very hard to kind of change some of the labor practices, and they've been successful in starting that happening. The last point on the world tour, this is China, and it's here for two reasons. One is because it's the next country that's hosting a World's Fair, the Expo 2010 in Shanghai, and also it's the second largest shipbuilding nation in the world. First is South Korea, third is Japan. Here's the expo site. It's on the river running through Shanghai. Like other expos, there's been quite a lot of displacement to create the land for the expo, because you need a huge amount of land, and when you put it into the middle of a dense urban environment, you have to take a lot of things out. One of the things that's been displaced is the Jiangnan shipyard, which is a historic shipyard. It's one of Shanghai province's oldest, and it's being moved to this Chengxing shipbuilding island, where Shanghai province is consolidating all of its shipbuilding industry into this one island, making the largest shipbuilding area of its kind in the world. Actually, this seems like actually to me a very typical kind of Chinese urban project. Here's a picture of the shipyard while it was still in use. It's really enormous. And then here's the World's Fair site again. So the shipyard's on the north side of the river, the Puxi side, if you know Shanghai. And then on the Pudong side, the south side, this huge area that you see being cleared, this was a former industrial area where there was a big Krups factory, solid steel production, and a sizable village of about 20,000 people. So all of this was moved. The steel industry was not moved because it was determined that this was no longer a relevant industry for an urban area, so I don't actually know what happened to the steel industry in all of its parts. But the 20,000 people were moved in Chinese urban renewal projects or industrial hydro energy projects always result in massive displacements. This is actually very small by Chinese standards, and it was done very humanely by Chinese standards. So, and I actually was just in Shanghai, and I got to talk to the real estate developer who built the buildings that people were moved into, and he was very proud that people were only moved 2.5 kilometers away from their original home. Usually what happens is that people are moved to like the very outskirts of the city, and they lose all connections to their former communities and jobs and things like that. There's always ironies in expo sites, and this one is definitely full of ironies. So they took out the real city and then they put in the simulated city block. And then this is the Danish, Dutch pavilion under construction, which is a series of small Dutch houses. So there's all these kinds of reproductions of cities or representations of cities in the place of the real city that was removed. So back to the full piece, and you can see how things connect. Just a note about the title, which is Mappamundi, which is a reference to medieval world maps that conflated real and imaginary geography. Here's an example of one. This is the Harrisburg Mappamundi, one of the most famous. This is a kind of drawing of it, not the real thing, not a photo of it. And back to the idea of the world map being both functional and ideological. So this was on display in a cathedral, so you can see it as a kind of ideological educational tool, because the geography is not, the physical geography is not exact. These kinds of mappamundis were actually divided into a kind of T shape. I forget which is which, but there's maybe Asia's on top or Europe's on top, and Asia's on one side and Africa's on the other. Although maybe you can talk, you know this, I think. But anyway, what's at the center is Jerusalem, and at the top. So you have a lot of religious imagery within this map, right on top of the physical geography. So kind of biblical places that don't necessarily, some which don't necessarily exist in reality. And then another kind of historical map that the Mappamundi, my Mappamundi is related to, is a Portolan chart. These were kind of the road maps of medieval times, even though there were probably thousands of them, but the ones that are still remaining are the more decorative, the highly aesthetic decorative ones that are in royal atlases and things like that. So this is a Japanese Portolan chart, actually. And what they are is, it basically tells you how to get from here to there. What's important is the ocean, not the landmass. You notice the landmass is blank. The only thing that you really is articulated is the coastline. So it really shows you how to make physical connections between places and therefore bring them closer together. And thanks.